Hello, welcome to Stop the Guesswork, Defining Leadership for Your Organization. So, I'm going to start with some brief introductions of myself and our topic, and then we'll walk through framing what competencies are, and you will learn an easy method to pressure test whether or not you have competencies or maybe something else. I will be presenting my favorite method for defining leadership competencies within your organization and applying them. So, first, let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Chelsea Side, and I'm the founder and CEO of Talent Praxis, a boutique leadership development company. At Talent Praxis, I work as one of our executive coaches, facilitators, and I'm the primary advisor to all of our company partners. I'm also the co founder of Trio Coaching Academy, an ICF accredited coach training academy, where I helped build all of our curriculum, shape the business strategy, and serve as one of the primary facilitators and mentor coaches. My background is in leadership development, HR, and business operations. And earlier in my career, I worked internally across a variety of industries and roles. Then in 2017, I moved to executive coaching, first co founding a venture backed coaching company and now running my own boutique. So, across this work, I've designed custom leadership development programs for over 50 organizations and coached over 245 leaders. So, today I'll be sharing my best practices for developing competencies with companies and leaders to ensure that they're practical and actually effective. So, our purpose of today, as I mentioned, is to give you practical tools that you can actually apply tomorrow in your organization. We'll start by getting clear on what we actually mean by leadership and competencies, so we're working from the same foundation. And then I'll walk through a simple, repeatable process for defining or refining a set of competencies. Finally, we'll focus on how you can use competencies in daily work so they create an impact. Now, for session resources, I have built for you a written resource that compiles all of our key slide insights, as well as speaker notes, and a recorded walkthrough of this workshop content. I also have our leadership competencies guide. So please go ahead, scan that QR code so you can make sure to access those resources. So let's start with framing. Here we're creating a shared foundation for leadership competencies. So what are competencies? Well, competencies are already operating in every organization because they're just leadership behaviors, whether they're defined or not. So every time a leader is hired, promoted, or let go, the organization is reinforcing the results and behaviors that are valued. The issue isn't whether or not competencies exist, it's whether they're clearly defined and applied intentionally. When competencies aren't explicit, the leaders who tend to succeed are often those who best anticipate expectations or read informal cues and navigate the system well. It may or may not be the top behavior that you actually want to be reinforcing. So, well defined competencies create predictability. So, they're going to help you identify who's likely to succeed, who should be promoted, and they're going to help leaders understand what effective leadership looks like in practice in a way that supports both the leader's success and the organizational goals. So, in the spirit of clarity, I always like to start by defining my own terms. You're going to hear me say leadership and management a lot today. So, what is leadership? My favorite leadership definition is that leadership is influencing, inspiring, and motivating others to achieve shared outcomes. And management is organizing people, processes, and resources to execute plans effectively. Now, these both come from Nordhaus Leadership textbook, but this slide isn't about debating definitions. Leadership versus management, we all know, is a well-covered and well-debated topic. What matters is how you within your organization want to define these things. You could separate them or you could intentionally combine them, but regardless, your definition for leadership and management is going to shape the competencies you create. As an example, I worked with an EVP who initially only wanted to define leadership-focused competencies, right? And we agreed to a leadership definition. But then after talking with their HR partner, it became very clear that the biggest challenges on the team were actually needing more support around management behaviors. So having these definitions lets you ask better questions and ultimately surface the most important and priority competencies. These questions could be, how much of this role is about inspiring and motivating others? How much of this role is about organizing and executing work? And those answers are going to directly influence the priority of the competencies that you define. So, starting with definitions. If your organization hasn't formally defined leadership or management, that's very common. You don't need to start from scratch. You could use my definitions if you like them, right? And they resonate with your organization. They're not mine. They're from academic textbooks. You could also define them based on the roles that are already at play in your organization. So you likely have captured leadership as a definition and management as a definition in your job descriptions, your role profiles, or your expectations documents. So, one practical approach, take a few representative leadership or management job descriptions, put them in your favorite AI tool, and ask it to draft a clear definition of leadership and or management based on those roles. Not to create some final permanent definition for leadership, but just to surface a pattern and a framing and a starting point for you. Okay, so what are competencies? Competencies are observable leadership behaviors. It's how the work is done. Now, competencies are different from skills, which are capabilities someone uses to do the work. They're different from attributes or personality traits, how people show up and the qualities that make up a person. And they're different from experience or knowledge. Experience or knowledge provide a leader with the information and the expertise to execute a competency. So skills, attributes, and knowledge are very important, and they can vary widely. This is what gives us super diverse leaders who are able to be successful. Because leaders can draw on endless combinations of their skills and strengths, endless combinations of their attributes and personality traits, and endless combinations of their experience and knowledge to successfully execute the same competency or behavior. So let's walk through an example. The competency is builds consensus and values input. And this behavior can be supported by a diverse group of skills, attributes, and experiences. So a skill that could support builds consensus and values input is active listening. So you're highly skilled at active listening, listening to understand, not to respond, ensuring ideas and concerns are fully considered. It's a skill of yours. It's something you've developed over time. This probably allows you to build consensus and value input better. Say you have an attribute or a personality trait of being someone who's naturally pretty inclusive. You naturally, intentionally invite other perspectives from different roles, levels, and backgrounds. It's really part of who you are. This will likely help you better build consensus and value input. Or let's look at your experience and knowledge. Let's say that throughout most of your roles, you've facilitated group decisions. You have hands-on experience guiding teams towards alignment without defaulting to authority. Maybe you have hands-on training doing that. And it will likely be very helpful for you to execute the competency of building consensus and valuing input. Now, there's so many different skills, strengths, attributes, traits, experience, knowledge that a leader could pair together to allow them to, in their own way, build consensus and value input. So now that we've defined what competencies are and really built that high level framing, I want to get into more specifics. We need a quick way to pressure test whether or not a competency is a competency. So if you've seen my other content, you know I like to reuse a few solid foundational tools across frameworks, and SMART is one of them. You likely have something else internally, whether it's SMART or a different acronym, whatever it is that helps you make things more specific and practical. You can pressure test your competencies against them. So we're not using SMART to write competencies. We're using it to check whether a competency is specific enough to be understood, observed, and applied consistently. So if SMART's unfamiliar, you can scan the QR code and access more, but you don't necessarily need to know it in detail to understand this gut check. So the first question we're going to ask once we've written a competency is it specific enough? Do we mean the same thing across the organization when defining this competency? So let's take collaborate with stakeholders. Is this competency specific enough? In some organizations, collaborate is well-defined, discussed, and reinforced. So if we say we expect leaders to collaborate with stakeholders, that could be specific enough. In other organizations, collaborate could be considered a buzzword. It means very different things to different leaders. So the test is whether you'd hear consistent examples. If you asked a handful of leaders, what does collaborate with stakeholders look like in practice? Do they give you the same or similar answers? If interpretations vary widely, the competency isn't specific enough. Define it more. So, specificity is about shared understanding. Next test we're going to use is very similar to specific, it's measurable. So, here we're going to be looking at whether or not our answers can actually be seen or observed in the workplace. So a competency like builds trust with a team may or may not be observable. Measurability comes from defining what you would actually see or hear when trust is being built. So if leaders can point to concrete, consistent behavioral examples of how they're practicing builds trust, then it is measurable. If their examples vary widely or they show up really inconsistently, your competency is just too vague, right? Again, make it more specific, define it a little bit more. So measurability when we're looking at competencies is observable evidence, not necessarily quantitative numbers. So ask, what does it look like for you to practice this, right? And see if they're all practicing it in similar enough ways. This is really dependent upon your organization and your goals. So our next pressure test is whether or not the competency is achievable. For competencies, achievable matters when in that the leader can actively practice the behavior and it's within their control. So competencies that sit outside of a leader's control are likely outcomes. They're not behaviors. So an outcome like meets deadlines or improves team performance are important, but they're the result of many inputs. The competency is the set of behaviors that the leader practices to influence outcomes. When a competency is written as an outcome, it's harder for a leader to know what to do differently. It's just less achievable, right? I know that's what you want me to do. How do I do it? When it's written as a behavior, it becomes more actionable. It's something a leader can actually practice, reflect on, and improve over time. So to ensure a competency is achievable, test that it's written as a behavior, not as an outcome. Let me show you some examples. An outcome, as I mentioned earlier, is meets deadlines. The associated behaviors could be that the leader sets clear priorities, aligns stakeholders and timelines, and addresses risks early. What you're trying to define is for your organization, for your work. What's the most important behavior? What's the most umbrella behavior, the leadership competency that will allow the leader to meet deadlines, to achieve outcome? Do one more. Outcome is improves team performance, an outcome we'd all like to achieve, right? Then the actual behaviors that could allow a leader to achieve it, maybe they establish clear expectations, they monitor progress, they adjust support based on performance and the needs of their team, right? Again, you're looking for what is the most important set of behaviors? What's the sort of umbrella overarching leadership behavior, leadership competency that will allow the leader to achieve the outcome? And this really will depend on your organization, your team, your structure, what you're needing. Our last gut check is relevant. Many leadership behaviors are important and helpful, but relevance is about prioritization. When everything's a competency, nothing's a competency. So the question is, which behaviors most directly support your goals and outcomes right now? As an example, let's look at builds positive relationships, communicates clearly, supports team well-being. We can all agree these are super important. They may or may not be the highest priority or the most direct competency to impact outcomes. So it could be that aligns team goals to organizational priorities has more of a direct line to results. This depends on your organization. But hopefully this filter will help you narrow to the few competencies that truly matter for the role in the organization. And my recommendation is actually just start with a few that you think really matter. And then as you go, you'll refine them. So as a gut check, you can ask yourself, what are the top 3 to 5 competencies that have the biggest impact on your organization's goals and objectives? And my recommendation here is to guess. Pick anything, something. Just pick a starting place, and you'll be able to test it through the application, which we'll talk about in a moment. Okay. So before you can apply, you have to define. So now that you have a clear foundation for what a competency is and a way to test whether it's clear, observable, achievable, and relevant, the next step is defining them for your organization. If you already have them defined, maybe refine them. See if you come up with something new. So we're going to shift into my favorite simple framework for defining leadership competencies. So there are two primary approaches that we see that organizations use to define competencies today. The first is top down. So this is going to start with the organization's strategies, goals, and mission, and then work backwards. Given our strategy, goals, and our mission, what are the leadership behaviors needed to achieve them? Second is bottom up. Here, you're going to gather broad input across the organization, maybe across all of your leaders, managers, maybe across everyone in the organization. What does effective leadership look like here? You're going to aggregate all that information to define your leadership competencies. I've utilized both these approaches internally and as a consultant, and they work. But I often find they're too time intensive, they're pretty consensus heavy, and they can be hard to apply. They also tend to be less practical because they're starting with hypothetical or ideal behaviors. This is what we want to achieve, rather than the observed ones that are already successful today. So they can feel like a round peg, square hole exercise, trying to fit leaders into a model instead of defining what successful leadership already looks like. So the third option, and my favorite, starts somewhere different. This is a behavior-based approach, and we're going to look at leadership behaviors that are already being reinforced in the organization through hiring, promotions, performance feedback, and recognition. So if competencies are behaviors and leaders are already demonstrating them every day, then we can observe patterns and who succeeds and why to get a grounded starting point on real decisions and real outcomes. So this approach doesn't replace strategy, which is important and we'll use. It doesn't replace input from others, but it can be faster, more practical, and easier to iterate. With just one leader in your organization, you can begin to define leadership competencies. You yourself in your own role can probably use this to define leadership competencies and then get input to refine them. So it gives you a short list you can test, refine, rather than a model that you're going to have to convince people to adopt. So this isn't about evaluating people or names, and it can feel that way. We're not trying to call out specific people. Instead, you're looking for patterns of behavior. You're thinking about the leaders who consistently succeed in your organization. What are the behaviors that show up repeatedly? What's present? And then you're thinking about leaders who may struggle more in your organization. What are the behaviors they're doing repeatedly? What's the opposite of those? What's missing from their behaviors? So we're using real examples to ground this in reality, not hypotheticals. So I recommend taking 3 minutes and reflecting on these questions and actually observing what you come up with. Then, as next steps for after today, you can take those leadership behaviors you began to draft based on the top 3 performers and bottom 3 performers and look for patterns across the behaviors you've identified. So begin grouping them and bucketing them together, and then coming up with umbrella competency terms for things that are similar. Then pressure test those umbrella competencies using SMART to make them even more clear, observable, achievable, and relevant. And then prioritize your list based on the organizational goals, right? Relevant. What are the top 3 or 5? Start small and iterate. Competencies get better through use, not having some perfect PDF to send to everyone, but having a short list that you can test. So now that you have a clear way to define top 3 to 5 competencies and a simple process to refine them using SMART, I want to talk about how you can apply them because defining competencies isn't the finish line. Application is where you're going to start to shape decisions and behaviors. So next we'll look at where competencies actually show up in the day-to-day and how to embed them into the systems leaders already interact with most. So most often when competencies are developed after a long development process, they're rolled out as a formal framework. Hopefully this includes clear names, definitions, some supporting examples. And while that can create clarity, it also makes the framework feel very concrete and final, especially if it's shared as a PDF. So once it's launched, then it's likely embedded, right? Now you're including it directly into hiring and interview questions, into performance systems and performance review questions. Once that happens, there's really little room left for learning or iteration. Competencies can become a reference to comply with rather than something leaders are actively using, testing, and refining in daily work. So instead, I like to start with daily use. Really, you can run on daily use for a pretty long time. So, as an HR L&D leader, this often means that you are coaching your leaders and managers through this process, or you're training your leaders and managers to embed competencies in their everyday work and to coach their team members. I'll give you three examples of how. The first, when things go well, ask, which competencies showed up here? Did you observe anything new? Right? Help them to start connecting wins, successes, positive things to competencies you've defined together. When things don't go as planned, maybe they're coming to you with a concern or a complaint, or you're recognizing a challenge they're having with their team. What competencies were missing or underdeveloped? What would we need to see instead, right? What will we need to see differently here? What's missing from our list of what the key behaviors are for success of this organization? And then lastly is in your feedback and reinforcement conversations. So when a competency shows up, coach your leaders and managers to call it out explicitly and reinforce it. When it's missing, they can use feedback conversations to partner with their team on how it could show up differently next time. This is how competencies move from definitions, a PDF framework, to behaviors that are actually shaping the performance of the organization. So let me give you an example. I work with several senior leaders who manage teams of VPs, directors, and we've developed leadership competencies as a roadmap to help them evaluate performance more consistently across their teams. So when they bring me a new challenge or question, I'll often start by asking, what did the leader actually do in this situation? How did that behavior impact the outcome? Or what did you actually do in this situation? How did your behavior impact the outcome? Once we start discussing behaviors, we're sort of like qualitative complaints, we can then connect it back to the competencies that we've already defined. You've named XYZ as core leadership competencies. What does this situation connect to? Is this an example of one of those behaviors? Is this surfacing something new that we should explore? If the competencies have already been communicated as expectation to their team members, it's even better. We can go deeper. Here, coach them through things like your leaders know you expect them to XYZ. What do you think happened here? What does this leader need from you to move forward successfully? So that's what the daily use looks like. Competencies are guiding real conversations, not just sitting as a framework. I want to leave you with this framing. Competencies work best when they're used as a guide for reflection and growth, not as a compliance tool. When leaders have clear expectations, they can self-correct more quickly and grow more intentionally. That's when competencies actually start to support performance and development. So for full session resources, all of the notes that I've shared today, as well as our leadership competencies guide, please visit the QR code here. If you have any questions, you can reach me at chelsea@talentpraxis.com. I hope to hear from you soon.